Number 9. Aircraft Graveyard. After World War II ended, the U.S. military no longer had any use for most of the equipment it had used in the fight against the Axis powers. Consequently, the machinery was often just left to rot in vehicle graveyards, many of which still exist today. A young urban exploration photographer named Johnny Jew recently explored one of these sites in Ohio, where he found the sad, rusting remains of fighter jets and other aircraft that look plain old pitiful compared to the proud appearance they once carried during their glory days. He captured photos of the deserted plane sitting in the snow, surrounded by trees and scrap metal. Jew later reported that he was driving around in search of derelict buildings to photograph when he noticed a large, open space on the map that he was looking at. He decided to check the area out and found the plane graveyard. Someone was at the property, and instead of kicking the young man out, they offered him some history on its contents and let him snap some pictures. Unlike other sites that are filled with decaying World War II equipment, the plane graveyard that Jew stumbled across was created by a private owner. In the 1940s, a scrapyard worker named Walter Zaplata began buying decommissioned military aircraft and reassembling them in his backyard. The collection of around 30 rebuilt vehicles includes a deteriorating F-86D fighter plane, a U.S. Air Force B-25 plane, and an old Boeing 727. Zaplata left the site to his family when he passed away in 2010, and they've worked to keep it a secret to prevent thieves from stealing and scrapping parts from the historic pieces. Number 8. KISKA Submarine. There's a whale-shaped midget submarine that sits on the shore of a remote Alaskan island called KISKA. When the Japanese Navy occupied the island in 1942, they brought 6 of these cartoon-like vehicles with them. Only one survives today, and it's rapidly decaying from years of being battered by the elements. It sits on the grass off KISKA Harbor as a lonely, rusting reminder of one of the darkest chapters in world history. The 78-foot-long battery-powered submarine had a tiny interior with just enough room for 2 people. Speaking with the Anchorage Daily News, archaeologist Deborah Corbett said that she couldn't imagine a worse job than having to operate one of these claustrophobic vehicles. Midget submarines like this could only dive about 100 feet below the water's surface, and their range was limited to about 90 miles. They also couldn't be charged at sea, leaving ship crews tasked with recovering them. The KISKA submarine was not a suicide vehicle, but it didn't have a high survivability rate, according to researcher Richard Galloway. As many as 7,200 Japanese soldiers were stationed at KISKA, where they remained for 14 months. The American and Canadian militaries reclaimed the island in August 1943 as part of a joint mission codenamed Operation Cottage. They expected the Japanese to resist and were surprised to find that the enemy had fled before Allied forces even arrived. The submarine is one of the only remaining signs of the former Japanese presence, and it will eventually rust away completely. Number 7. The USS Sperry. Named for American inventor and entrepreneur Elmer Sperry, the USS Sperry was a type of ship called a submarine tender. Its job was to supply and support submarines. Built for the U.S. Navy in 1941, she was launched just 10 days after Japan's infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. The Sperry spent several months in Australia, where she refitted 7 submarines. In 1943, the vessel spent 4 months in Pearl Harbor. From there, she headed to Midway Atoll in the South Pacific, where she saw the busiest period of her career, servicing more than 70 submarines over a 5-month period. The vessel spent the remainder of the war traveling back and forth between the Marshall Islands, the Marianas Islands, Pearl Harbor, and other parts of the U.S. After the war ended, the Sperry ended up at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard outside Los Angeles. In 1961, she underwent a modernization program. For the next 2 decades, the ship serviced submarines out of San Diego. She was finally decommissioned in 1982 and spent years rotting away among a collection of derelict submarines at the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington State. The ship was sold to a private buyer in 2011 for over $1.5 million, with plans to be dismantled. By then, the Sperry had been relocated to Suisun Bay outside San Francisco, where it sat among a fleet of rusting and rotting military ships. She was finally scrapped later that year. Number 6. MAUNSELL Forts. A series of armed towers known as the MAUNSELL Forts punctuate Great Britain's Thames estuary. Built in 1942, these strange-looking structures were used by the British Army and Royal Navy for anti-aircraft defense and to deter and report German air raids. Each Navy fort had 7 floors and housed 120 soldiers. They were built offshore and were then sunk into place at their current sites. There were also several clusters of Army forts which were interconnected by walkways. They were designed to look futuristic and were slightly different, but equally as bizarre as the Navy structures. The MAUNSELL forts were decommissioned and abandoned during the 1950s, just a handful of years after the war ended. Over the following decades, several were taken over and used as the headquarters of various pirate radio stations. Many of the MAUNSELL forts still stand today, but only some of them are even remotely usable. Their future remains uncertain as they fall further and further into disrepair. One of the surviving structures functions as the so-called Principality of Sealand, a self-proclaimed independent state that declared sovereignty in 1967. It was founded by a former British Army major named Paddy Roy Bates, who had served in World War II. The British government doesn't recognize Sealand as a legitimate country. In fact, no country does. But the people who live there don't seem to be doing any harm, so the government more or less just leaves them alone. While the rest of the world may find the entire concept of Sealand amusing, its inhabitants take it very seriously. The Principality of Sealand has an official Facebook page and even boasts a royal family. Its current princess, Charlie Bates, has held her position since 2013, just a few years before the former princess, Joan Bates, presumably Charlie's grandmother or great-grandmother, passed away. What do you think of Sealand? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Number 5. IMARI Kawanami Shipyard. Built in 1851 on the Japanese island of Kyushu, the IMARI Kawanami Shipyard's history predates World War II by nearly a century. During the conflict, it functioned as a munitions and boat factory, employing 2,500 workers at its peak. This is where the Japanese manufactured the notorious Kaiten, or human torpedoes, that its navy used for carrying out suicide missions against the Allies toward the end of the war. The Japanese military had started to consider this extreme last-ditch option in 1943 as the war began turning in favor of the Allies. Several suicide vehicles were developed in a seemingly desperate attempt to help the Axis powers gain an upper hand. Most of the Kai-10 that the military developed were thankfully never used. The ones that did enter service caused more deaths to the Japanese than they did to their enemies. The shipyard continued building and repairing ships until 1953. In 2011, it was demolished and repurposed as a public park. Number 4. FLAK Towers. After the British Royal Air Force attacked Berlin in 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered the construction of large anti-aircraft towers in several major cities, including Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna. Known as FLAK towers, these massive concrete structures defended against Allied attacks and doubled as air raid shelters. They had a holding capacity of up to 10,000 civilians and even had room for a hospital ward. Hitler wasted no time building the FLAK towers. He rushed the supplies in by train, and they were completed in just 6 months. Each property consisted of a large tower for gun mounds and a smaller tower which functioned as a control and command center. With walls up to 11 feet thick, the FLAK towers were incredibly resistant to attacks. Their guns were capable of firing up to 8,000 rounds per minute, although their firepower was limited. Only one type of the guns housed within the structures was capable of defending against heavy U.S. and British Air Force bombers. As the war drew to a close and the Red Army encroached on Berlin in 1945, the Nazis used the FLAK towers as some of their last holdouts. But they couldn't stay there forever, and they eventually ran out of supplies and surrendered. Most of the smaller towers were demolished or buried after the war, but the Soviets had struggled to destroy the large towers during the war and deemed it infeasible to tear them down. Some of the FLAK towers that are still standing have been repurposed. A tower in Vienna is home to an aquarium and a climbing wall, and another in Germany houses several nightclubs and other businesses. Number 3. Battery 223. Off the Cape May, New Jersey coast, there's a drab concrete structure that seems rather out of place against the scenic backdrop of the Atlantic Ocean. The locals all know about it, but it tends to take many visitors by surprise. Known as Battery 223, the building functioned as a harbor defense battery during World War II for the U.S. Army's Fort Miles installation. It's just one of numerous fortifications along America's east and west coasts that were built in 1943 as part of a military modernization program. With 6-inch thick reinforced concrete walls and a blast-proof roof, Battery 223 was built to withstand direct hits from battleships and aircrafts. The structure was hidden using sand and earth and was equipped with 6-inch guns that had a 9-mile range, which were fortunately never fired against an enemy. Battery 223 was decommissioned in 1944 as the war turned in favor of the Allies and as advancing technology rendered the fort obsolete. The Navy used it for radio communications for a brief period after 1958. In 1962, it became part of Cape May Point State Park. The site looks much different now than it did nearly 80 years ago. When the battery was built, it sat roughly 900 feet from the shoreline. Today, it sits right up against the water, and it's also no longer covered in dirt, although plants still grow on the roof. Number 2. HMS Urge. The British U-class submarine HMS Urge was launched in 1940 and spent the majority of her career sinking German ships in the Mediterranean. 2 years later, it left Malta for Alexandria, Egypt, but never reached its destination. Until recently, nobody knew for sure what happened to it, although all signs pointed toward the sub having been sunk by the Nazis. These suspicions were confirmed in 2019 when the wreck was discovered off the Maltese coast. It had been struck by a mine and came to a rest 400 feet below the waves. Experts from the University of Malta have spent the past 20 years mapping the seafloor in the region, but as of 2 years ago, they hadn't yet located the Urge. Francis Dickinson, whose grandfather was the submarine's commander, reached out to the team in hopes that they could find the wreck. And they did with the help of an underwater vehicle and sonar. The British Ministry of Defense announced the news after confirming the submerged vessel's identity as the Urge. Before it was found, there was widespread scrutiny about where the submarine had ended up and how it got wherever it was. In 2015, Belgian historian Jean-Pierre Misson claimed to have found the wreck off the Libyan coast, far from its planned course. But experts ran into bureaucratic red tape and were unable to look into the matter firsthand, which turned out to be a time and money-saving blessing in disguise, since we now know that Misson's suspicions that he'd found the Urge were incorrect. Number 1. Weingut 1. During the latter years of World War II, the Third Reich tried to build a network of underground bunkers and factories that could withstand Allied bombing campaigns. They implemented one such facility, codenamed Weingut 1, in the remote wilderness outside Munich in southeastern Germany. It was planned as a 9-story factory for building jet engines that would be hidden from view with soil and plants. But the Allies had already seized control of German airspace by the time construction began, making it nearly impossible to build the massive facility unnoticed. The Nazis were losing the war, and it quickly became clear that Weingut 1 would never be built on time to advance their agenda in any meaningful way. But the Germans proceeded with the project anyway, working hastily in an attempt to meet their self-imposed 6-month deadline. More than 8,500 of the 10,000 workers who built the site were forced laborers. Over 3,000 of them were cruelly worked to death, died from starvation, or otherwise perished from the brutal treatment they suffered at the hands of the Nazis. Keeping the massive structure a secret from the U.S. military ultimately proved impossible. American forces captured aerial images of it, but chose not to bomb the site, perhaps because they knew that there was a forced labor camp nearby. They may have also refrained from attacking Weingut 1 because they knew that there was no way it would be finished by the end of the war. Maybe it even distracted the Nazis in a way that benefited the Americans. Only 7 of the 12 planned bunker sections were built before the U.S. Army took over the site in 1945. 2 years later, they demolished all but one section, which still stands alone in the wilderness today. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about fascinating abandoned World War II discoveries, let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.